Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so today we're diving into a moment that I think really just sent shockwaves through America, the Kent State shootings of 1970.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine, a nation just consumed by the Vietnam War and these college campuses like erupting in protests.
Right.
And this palpable tension. You can just feel it even looking back, through the sources. And we're going to unpack all of this using this episode of Mr. Hutchings History that really focuses on Kent State and these protest movements and, the government's reaction. But here's the real question we're going to grapple with today.
Right.
How did a student rally turn deadly? And what does it reveal about the limits of dissent, in a democracy?
Yeah.
It's a story that I think still has a lot to teach us today.
Oh, absolutely. I think what's so fascinating about this is, this is an event from over 50 years ago.
Right.
And it continues to resonate, I think, in a way that very few historical events do. And so I think going back and, sort of dissecting and exploring this historical moment can really help us understand some of the, complexities of free speech, the, role of government power, and I think also just the consequences of political polarization.
Yeah, and Mr. Hutchings' history really does paint this vivid picture of the era.
Yeah.
It all begins with President Nixon's decision to expand the Vietnam War into Cambodia in April of 1970. Now, he aimed to disrupt enemy supply lines, but this move ignited a firestorm of protests across American universities. Over 80% saw demonstrations.
Wow.
Some were peaceful. Others, unfortunately, escalated into riots. Why did this particular action trigger such a powerful backlash?
Yeah, well, I think it's crucial to remember the context.
Okay.
Nixon had campaigned on a promise to end the war.
Right.
And so expanding it into Cambodia felt like a betrayal to many, particularly the younger generation. And I think that's one of the key things is it shattered this very fragile trust that existed between the government and the people. And I think it fueled the perception that the war was spiraling out of control. So that this decision wasn't just about military strategy. It was a political earthquake, I think, that really exposed deep divisions within American society.
Okay. So we've got a nation on edge. We've got a war that's deeply unpopular, a president who's facing a major crisis of confidence.
Right.
And this is where Kent State takes center stage.
Yep.
The episode talks about how tensions were already escalating there.
Okay.
Students rioting in town. The ROTC building being set on fire. Then the Ohio governor calls in the National Guard.
Right.
Equipped with rifles and tear gas. Was bringing in the National Guard really the best move here?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like it just poured gasoline on an already raging fire.
Well, I think the arrival of the National Guard dramatically shifted the dynamic. Right. Remember, these are students protesting a war.
Right.
And suddenly they were confronted with armed soldiers on their own campus.
Yeah.
So it created this atmosphere of fear and intimidation.
Right.
And it signaled that the government was willing to use force to maintain order.
Right.
Even against its own citizens. So it's a moment that raises profound questions about the appropriate use of military force in a democratic society.
And then the unthinkable happens. On May 4th, 1970, the National Guard opens fire on a student gathering.
Right.
4 students are killed, 9 wounded. 2 of them, Sandra Scheuer and William Schroeder, weren't even part of the protest. They were just walking to class. It's just chilling.
Yeah.
It's a chilling reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control.
Yeah.
And the tragic consequences of using lethal force in just this really charged environment.
Yeah. And I think, the fact that 2 innocent bystanders were killed really underscores the indiscriminate nature of the violence. And the sense of chaos that I think gripped Kent State that day.
Right. Yeah.
And it really transformed the event from, just a campus protest into a national tragedy.
Right.
And it forced the nation to confront, I think, the devastating consequences of its political and social divisions.
It's heartbreaking. And the public's reaction was completely divided. Nixon even dismissed the protesters as bums blowing up the campuses.
Right.
Which probably didn't help matters.
Yeah.
The episode mentions that a poll at the time showed 58% of Americans blamed the students.
Wow.
It seems like there wasn't a lot of middle ground.
Yeah. I mean, this is where we see, I think, the deep polarization of the era. It's a stark illustration of how a single event can be interpreted through, vastly different lenses, shaped by, pre-existing beliefs and biases. So the shootings became a flashpoint.
Right.
Further dividing a nation already struggling with, the turmoil of war and social change.
And tragically, the violence doesn't end there. Just 10 days later, there's another shooting, this time at Jackson State University, a historically black college in Mississippi. Police fire on a women's dormitory, killing 2 students and wounding 12.
Wow.
It's a chilling reminder that the unrest and violence weren't isolated incidents.
Yeah, and I think the Jackson State shooting, often overshadowed by Kent State, raises the critical questions about race and media coverage in America, right? Why didn't it receive the same level of attention and outrage?
Right.
And I think the answer likely lies in the systemic biases that have long plagued our nation.
Right.
It forces us to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that some tragedies receive more attention than others based on the race of the victims.
It's a sobering thought. And Nixon's response to this wave of unrest was pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about containing the immediate fallout from Kent State. It seems like he was trying to quell dissent on a much broader scale.
Right.
What was he thinking? Was he genuinely concerned about national security? Or was it more about preserving his own power? I'm really curious to unpack this more.
Well, I think Nixon's reaction reveals a lot about his leadership style and his view of executive power. He saw these protests as a direct challenge to his authority and responded with this multifaceted approach that blended appeasement with a firm hand. So he wasn't simply reacting to events. He was actively shaping the narrative and trying to control the national conversation.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's dig into the specific tactics Nixon used and what they reveal about his strategy for dealing with the growing dissent. It sounds like there's a lot more to uncover here.
It's like he was playing chess.
Yeah.
He had to really carefully consider each move, balancing that need to, quell the unrest, but also the risk of further alienating the public.
Right.
So one tactic was to actually target the financial lifeline of the protest movement, student financial aid. He pushed through these measures that would cut off aid to students who were convicted of crimes during protests or those who violated campus rules.
That's pretty cunning. It's not a direct assault on free speech,
Right.
but it's a way to kind of undermine the movement by hitting them in the pocketbook. Did it work?
Yeah, it definitely created a chilling effect. The threat of losing financial aid forced students to, I think, weigh the risks of activism more carefully.
Right.
But Nixon didn't stop there. He also realized that the draft was a major source of anxiety and anger, fueling the protests.
Right.
And so in 1972, he actually adjusts the draft policy so that students over 20 were no longer vulnerable to the draft.
So he takes away one of the most immediate consequences of the war for a significant portion of the student population.
Right.
And it seems like such a strategic way to de-escalate the situation without appearing to give in to the demands of the anti-war movement.
Precisely. But he didn't shy away from more forceful tactics either. So just a few weeks after Kent State, there were mass arrests of demonstrators in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
Over 10,000 people were arrested.
Wow.
And a lot of those cases were later dismissed because of, civil rights violations.
Right.
But it sent a clear message that the government was not afraid to use its power to disrupt and intimidate those who challenged its authority.
So it was this combination of targeted strategies and then these shows of force.
Right.
A little bit of carrot and stick, you could say.
Exactly.
It really speaks to the complexity of Nixon's character. That he was willing to negotiate and compromise on some issues, but he could also be incredibly ruthless when he felt threatened.
Exactly. And, we shouldn't forget about the expansion of surveillance under his watch. The FBI was heavily involved in monitoring and infiltrating protest groups. Wow. And the administration also pursued numerous court cases against activists. Which, even if they were ultimately successful, for the activists, drained their resources and really wore them down.
Yeah, it's a reminder that power can be exercised in these subtle ways that aren't always visible to the public. And this covert side of Nixon's response really adds another layer, I think,
Absolutely,
to our understanding of how he dealt with dissent.
it's a crucial point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the events at Kent State weren't just about what happened on that one tragic day. They were part of this broader pattern of government actions designed to suppress dissent and maintain control. And it's a pattern that's been repeated throughout history. And it's something that we need to be vigilant about, especially in times of crisis.
Now, you mentioned earlier that, there are these various ways that historians have interpreted the Kent State shootings. And it's so intriguing to think about how different perspectives really shape our understanding of history.
Absolutely.
Can you unpack some of those interpretations for us? I think our listener would be really curious
to know more. I think let's start with the progressive view. Okay. Progressive historians often see the Kent State shootings as a stark example of government overreach and the suppression of democratic dissent. They argue that Nixon's policies, particularly his escalation of war and his inflammatory rhetoric about protesters, created the conditions that made this kind of tragedy possible.
So they're essentially holding Nixon and his administration accountable for creating the climate that led to the use of deadly force against these protesters. That's a pretty damning indictment.
Yes. And they also emphasize the chilling effect these events had on free speech and political activism. They argue that the shootings sent a message. If you dare to challenge the government, you could face dire consequences.
Makes you wonder if some folks were just hesitant to speak out in fear of reprisal.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing there are other viewpoints that offer a different take.
Absolutely. Conservative historians tend to focus more on the violent actions of some protesters, like the burning of the ROTC building at Kent State. They argue that the presence of the National Guard was justified, given the threat to public safety, and that the shootings, while tragic, were the result of, a chaotic situation spiraling out of control.
So from their perspective, the blame lies more with the protesters who resorted to violence. And they see the National Guard's actions as a necessary response to maintain order. It's so interesting how these different interpretations can lead to such drastically different conclusions.
That's the beauty of history. It's not always clear cut. And there are even more perspectives to consider. Social historians, for example, bring a different lens to the story. They focus on the generational divide and the cultural clash that was happening in America at the time. They see these protests as part of a larger youth movement that was challenging traditional values and demanding change.
So they frame it less as this battle between, right and wrong. And more as this...
a clash of cultures.
Clash of cultures and ideologies. Kind of a societal growing pain.
Precisely. It's a reminder that, historical events are often rooted in these complex social and cultural transformations. And then there's the Marxist analysis. Marxist historians view the Kent State shootings through the lens of class struggle and state power. They argue that the shootings represent the state's willingness to use violence to protect the interests of the ruling class and to suppress a movement that threatened the capitalist system.
So it's about power dynamics and who benefits from the existing social order. And they see this crackdown on dissent as a way to maintain the status quo and protect the interests of the elite.
They argue that the shootings weren't just a tragic accident, but rather a calculated act of state violence. Designed to crush a movement that was challenging the foundations of power.
It's fascinating how one event can be interpreted in so many different ways, with each offering, a valuable piece of the puzzle. It really underscores the importance of critical thinking and examining history from multiple perspectives. Something that really stuck with me from the Mr. Hutchings History episode was the fact that two of the students killed, Sandra Scheuer and William Schroeder, weren't even involved in the protests. They were just walking to class.
It's heartbreaking.
And that detail just really drives home the randomness of the violence and the sense of chaos that must have prevailed.
It's a heartbreaking reminder that even in a democracy, innocent people can become victims of state violence. And I think it raises these really important questions
Yeah.
about the responsibility of those in power
Right.
to exercise restraint and protect the rights of all citizens, even those who are critical of the government.
And it also makes me wonder about the psychological impact on, the survivors, the families of those who were killed, the entire Kent State community who had to live with the trauma of that day for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. I mean, the trauma of Kent State reverberated far beyond, the immediate victims.
Right.
It left an indelible mark on the nation's psyche.
Yeah.
And I think forced us to confront, the dark undercurrents of violence and repression that can lurk, even in a society that prides itself on freedom and democracy.
It seems like the events at Kent State were just a turning point.
Yeah.
The relationship between the government and the people.
Yeah.
Did this event permanently erode public trust in authority?
I think it certainly contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment and cynicism, particularly among young people who felt betrayed by the government's actions.
Right.
The shootings became a symbol of government overreach.
Right.
And the dangers of unchecked power. And that distrust, I think, has lingered in American society ever since, shaping our political discourse and our relationship with those in authority.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how things might have unfolded differently if there had been more accountability for the shootings.
Yeah.
Did anyone face consequences for what happened?
Well, the pursuit of justice and accountability was a long and arduous process.
Yeah.
It took years for the families of the victims to receive any form of compensation.
Right.
And, the legal battles surrounding the shootings continued for decades.
Wow.
The Ohio National Guard members involved in the shootings were never criminally charged.
Wow.
Which further fueled that perception that the government was above the law.
It's a stark reminder that power often shields those who wield it from facing consequences for their actions.
It's a theme that sadly echoes through history, isn't it?
It really does. And it's a reminder that the struggle for justice is ongoing, and we must remain vigilant in holding those in power accountable for their actions.
For sure.
Speaking of those in power, I'm curious to kind of dig a little deeper into how Nixon handled the aftermath of the shootings. He really seemed to view these protests as this, personal attack, And how did that shape his response?
Well, Nixon was just this deeply complex and contradictory figure.
Right.
On one hand, he understood that he needed to address the concerns of the anti-war movement.
Right.
After all, he did, eventually withdraw American troops from Vietnam.
Right.
But on the other hand, he viewed the protests as a threat to his authority.
Right.
And responded with this combination of appeasement and aggression.
So he was trying to walk that tightrope
of
trying to placate the protesters while simultaneously undermining their movement and controlling the narrative.
Exactly. He was a master of political maneuvering.
Yeah.
But his actions ultimately backfired.
Yeah.
The shootings at Kent State and Jackson State became, defining moments of his presidency, symbols of his administration's heavy-handed approach to dissent.
It's interesting how these events continue to shape our understanding of Nixon's legacy even decades later.
Right.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past, it's about how we remember and interpret the past.
Exactly.
It's clear that the shootings at Kent State had a profound impact on the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about how this tragic event really shaped
sure.
the trajectory of the movement?
The impact was multifaceted.
Okay.
In many ways, the shootings actually galvanized the movement.
Okay.
And injected it with, I think, a renewed sense of urgency and moral authority. The image of those, dead and wounded students broadcast on television screens, printed in newspapers across the country, became a rallying cry for peace and justice.
So it intensified the outrage
and
mobilized even more people to join the cause.
Exactly.
It's a chilling example of how tragedy can sometimes fuel a movement's momentum.
It definitely can. But, it also introduced this element of fear and caution.
Right.
The specter of violence loomed large.
Yeah.
And it created a dilemma for activists.
Right.
And they had to weigh the importance of their message against the potential risks to themselves and others.
It's a tough balance to strike, especially when the stakes are so high. And it seems like the anti-war movement was already quite diverse with various factions advocating for different approaches.
Right.
How did these internal dynamics play out in the aftermath of Kent State?
Well, the shootings actually exacerbated,
Okay.
existing tensions within the movement.
Okay.
So some factions, particularly those who favored more radical approaches, like direct action and civil disobedience, felt vindicated by the events at Kent State.
Okay.
They argued that the government only responded to force,
Right.
and that peaceful protest was ineffective.
So they saw the violence as a justification
Exactly.
for escalating their tactics.
Exactly. But others, especially those committed to nonviolence, doubled down on their belief in peaceful resistance.
Okay.
They saw the shootings as, a tragic consequence of escalating tensions.
Right.
And argued that, violence only begets more violence.
It must have been just an incredibly challenging time for activists
Yeah.
trying to navigate these complex internal dynamics
Right.
while also grieving the loss of their comrades
Right.
and processing the trauma of the shootings.
It was a period of deep soul-searching and strategic reassessment.
Yeah.
And while the movement ultimately played a significant role in, helping to end the Vietnam War,
Right.
the scars of Kent State and Jackson State remained,
Yeah.
serving as a reminder of the price of dissent and the fragility of peace.
Speaking of lasting reminders, Neil Young's song Ohio comes to mind.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a powerful and haunting piece of music
Yeah.
that captures the raw emotion and outrage of the time. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners remember that iconic song.
Yeah, Ohio became an anthem for the anti-war movement.
Right.
And, Young's lyrics, "Four Dead in Ohio," really cut through the political rhetoric
Right.
and laid bare the human cost of the war
Mm.
and the government's crackdown on dissent.
Yeah.
The song resonated, I think, deeply with a generation that felt betrayed by their government
Yeah.
and disillusioned by the violence
Right.
they saw unfolding around them.
It's amazing how music can capture the essence of a historical moment
Yeah,
and convey emotions in a way that words sometimes just can't.
absolutely.
And it's not just Ohio. I mean, the Kent State shootings inspired countless other artists and writers and filmmakers,
Yeah.
ensuring that the memory of that day would live on
Yeah,
in the cultural consciousness.
for sure.
It seems like this event really transcended the realm of politics and just became ingrained in our collective memory
Yeah,
through art and expression.
absolutely. The events at Kent State became this touchstone for an entire generation,
Right.
shaping their worldview
Right.
and inspiring them to work for peace and justice.
Mm-hmm.
And, as we reflect on the legacy of Kent State,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that it's not just about the past.
Right.
It's about the present and the future. It's about learning from the mistakes of history
Right.
and working to create a more just and equitable world for all.
It's incredible to think that the events at Kent State unfolded over 50 years ago
I know.
and yet still feel so relevant today.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what are the key takeaways for us?
Yeah.
What lessons can we learn from this tragic
Yeah.
chapter in American history?
Well, I think Kent State serves as this stark reminder
Yeah.
that democracy is fragile
Mm-hmm.
and we must actively safeguard our fundamental freedoms.
Right.
The events of May 4th, 1970,
Yeah.
highlight the dangers of political polarization,
Right.
the potential for abuse of power,
Mm.
and the crucial need, I think, for open dialogue,
Yeah.
even when conversations are difficult.
It's easy to look back and judge the actions of those involved, but history is rarely black and white.
It's so true.
There were so many complexities and nuances at play.
You're absolutely right. It's essential to avoid oversimplification. Kent State wasn't simply a clash between students in the National Guard.
Right.
It was a nation grappling with a deeply unpopular war,
Yeah.
a society in upheaval,
Right.
and this growing chasm
Right.
between the government and its people.
And it underscores the importance of protests as this a vital sign
Absolutely.
of a healthy democracy.
It is.
The right to dissent,
Yeah.
to challenge those in power, and to demand change is so fundamental.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Kent State reminds us that silence is not always golden.
Right.
When injustice occurs, when rights are violated, when the powerful abuse their authority,
Mm-hmm.
it is our duty to speak up,
Yeah.
to raise our voices, and to demand accountability.
But then there's the question of how we protest.
Yeah.
How do we engage in dissent in a way that's both effective and responsible?
Right.
And Kent State highlights the potential for things to escalate so quickly and the importance of nonviolent resistance.
Absolutely. While violence may sometimes feel like the only option, history has shown time and again that it often leads to more suffering.
Right.
Nonviolent resistance, on the other hand, can be a powerful force for change.
Right. Yeah.
You know, look at the civil rights movement, for example.
Right. Yeah. And it makes me also think about the role of the media in all of this. The coverage of the Kent State shootings was really controversial at the time. Some outlets portrayed the students as victims.
Right.
Others blamed them for the violence.
Right.
It seems like the media played a big part in shaping public perception of the events.
The media's role is absolutely crucial, especially during times of crisis.
Right.
It's essential to be, critical consumers of information, seek out diverse perspectives, and be wary of narratives that oversimplify complex issues.
And with the rise of social media, we're just bombarded with even more information, It's harder to separate fact from fiction these days. How can we navigate this constant stream of information and develop a more discerning eye?
I think it's more important than ever
to
cultivate these media literacy skills. We need to be aware of our own biases, seek out information that challenges our assumptions, and be skeptical of anything that seems too good or too bad to be true.
It's also a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It shapes our present, our worldview, our policies, and our interactions with each other.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the echoes of Kent State can be seen in contemporary debates about, police brutality, the militarization of law enforcement, the right to protest. We can't afford to ignore the lessons of the past if we want to build a more just and equitable future.
As we conclude this deep dive into Kent State, it's striking how this event continues to resonate with us, prompting us to reflect on the delicate balance between freedom and security, the power of protest, and the enduring human cost of conflict.
And it underscores, I think, the importance of staying engaged, of raising our voices, and of holding those in power accountable.
Right.
The lessons of Kent State are timeless and universal.
Well said. And for our listeners, we encourage you to delve deeper into this topic, Explore the various perspectives. Consider what Kent State means to you. And contemplate how we can ensure that dissenting voices are heard without resorting to violence.
Absolutely.
How can we learn from the mistakes of the past to navigate the challenges we face today? I think these are questions worth pondering as we strive to create a more just and peaceful world.
Indeed. Remember, history is not just a collection of facts and dates. It's this living narrative that shapes who we are and who we aspire to be.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Appreciate it.
Into the Kent State shootings. It's been a somber but essential conversation.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a better future.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.